Long march through the unions, forging a revolutionary working class on shop floors and the streets. The Labor Line of the NCPC by the Central Committee of the NCPC, March 2025. The exploitation of proletarian labor power is the primary means by which capitalist society reproduces itself. Every new rent-seeking scheme or financial bubble is built atop a foundation laid by labor power and the surplus extracted from it. Maintaining and intensifying the daily, hourly exploitation of labor power lies at the heart of capitalist politics and public life. Through a process of protracted struggle, the proletariat learned through the 19th and into the 20th century that its hope for gaining an advantage rested on two facts: its overwhelming numerical superiority and its central position in production. Across the capitalist world, workers combined into unions and refined their organizational forms so they could leverage those advantages to shut down production and hurt their opponents, the capitalists, worse than they themselves could be hurt. This weapon, the strike, has primarily been used to advance the economic interest of specific workers. As the proletariat grew into political maturity, it learned to use the strike for political ends. It also learned the limitations of strictly economic organizations, and, where it was most advanced, combined these with the Communist Party, the United Front, and the People's Army to give itself maximum strategic latitude to conquer political power for itself. The strength of the communist movement in Canada has always correlated strongly with its base of support among the organized working class, that is, among the unions. This is because revolutionaries have used the occasions produced by the daily conflict between labor and capital playing out in workplaces to lead workers into class conflict, sharpen the contradictions between those two great social forces, and win them over to the only method for resolving those contradictions: revolution and communism. It is also because those workers can leverage their place in production by striking to win victories that would otherwise be impossible. The particularities have changed and require serious attention, but these general truths are as relevant for revolutionaries today as they were in decades past. As an advanced capitalist and imperialist country, Canada has intense specialization of its branches of industry, complex supply chains, a large service sector, and a highly interventionist state. All of these have serious implications for how revolutionaries ought to intervene in the primary site of workers' exploitation, the workplace. We therefore need to articulate an analysis of the current situation and lay out a strategy to guide us toward revolution. Our party has accepted the monumental dual task of defeating the Canadian bourgeoisie and establishing a multinational socialist confederacy. Essential to our strategy for carrying this out is the theory of worker centrality. Our purpose in this piece is to make the case for this position and draw out its implications for practice. That is, to articulate a line on the labor movement. This labor line can be summed up as building the proletariat's capacity to engage in political strikes, or in other words, harnessing its economic power to achieve political goals. Below, we also analyze some of the contending labor lines within the labor movement, both as a way of illustrating our own line in contrast to these, and to point out their flaws and shortcomings, in an attempt to win fellow labor organizers to our positions. Worker centrality. Our political goal is the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and the bourgeois state, conquest of power by the proletariat, and the establishment of a multinational socialist confederacy. The correct line on unions and the labor movement is the one that best serves these ends. If we're serious about taking power, we need a labor line that allows us to do two things: deal substantial blows to capital, and reproduce society under our own direction. Both of these require substantial power and organization in strategic industries. Agriculture, food processing, resource extraction, construction, manufacturing, transportation, and utilities are all essential for even the short-term maintenance and reproduction of a modern industrial society. Striking these can threaten the entire economy of a town, a region, or even the entire country, and so the ability to do so will be a vital weapon for the proletariat in both the long development of its struggle for political power and at the decisive moments when it chooses to initiate or exacerbate a revolutionary crisis. The education and healthcare sectors also bring together large numbers of workers, and are key factors allowing both the reproduction of the working class and a high rate of labor participation, and so can exercise similar power in a more indirect way. Likewise, running a socialist economy without near total organization in these industries will be impossible. Socialism will be many wonderful things, but it will not be a vacation. Rebuilding, reorganizing, and defending the new society will at times require tremendous sacrifices by the proletariat, including increased production quotas, wage restrictions, and labor force shortages. Workers will not tolerate this unless they are properly organized to have democratic input into the socialist economy, and properly led to see these sacrifices as necessary to their long-term liberation. Counter-revolutionary forces have the same ability to organize these workers as we do, and unless we have organized them first, reactionaries will wield their strikes as weapons against us. Contrast these strategic industries to other productive industries like food service and hospitality, to say nothing of the massive and parasitic banking, insurance, etc. industries that employ large numbers of proletarians. Such workers have an objective interest in the defeat of capitalism and have everything to gain by our victory, but are not able to exercise the same leverage against capital as a whole, nor are their industries as central to the reproduction of socialism as their counterparts in the strategic industries. Their place at the end of the supply chain also makes them vulnerable to job action in primary and secondary sectors of the economy. They are immediately dependent on inputs from those and so can easily be cut off from raw materials should a struggle escalate beyond a simple economic contract fight. This is not to say that we should shun organizing workers in retail, food service, etc. altogether. If we recruit someone who is an established leader in a grocery store, there are many benefits to having that person organize a union, fight the boss, politicize the struggles as much as possible, and push their central union in a more democratic, militant, and eventually revolutionary direction. This is a question of where to deliberately deploy our limited forces when we have the opportunity to do so in a premeditated way. In those cases, we must prioritize large shops in strategic industries. To put it bluntly, if we have the mines and factories organized, but not the coffee shops, we've got a chance at victory. But if instead we have the coffee shops organized, but not the mines and factories, we're doomed. The need for a revolutionary line on unions and labor follows from this reality, on opportunism or the labor aristocracy. Before elaborating more fully on our labor line, it is necessary to spend some time addressing whether the working class in the imperialist country, in whole or in part, is even capable of revolutionary consciousness in the first place. This question has fundamental implications for revolutionary strategy in our country, so we'll treat it first. The existence of super exploitation and subsequently of super profits creates the possibility of opportunism among the working class, as some sections of the class, and some more than others, do benefit from those super profits. Opportunism can only be relevant in a situation where substantial pro-worker concessions can be made without jeopardizing the capitalist system as a whole, and so super exploitation is a precondition for its emergence. This is not the same thing, however, as saying that these pro-worker concessions necessitate that opportunism prevail even among the workers who benefit from them, or that all workers with a standard of living above the bare cost of reproduction of their labor power are beneficiaries of these super profits, a position which was common, either on the level of formal line or implicitly in operational line during the third-party building movement, and in fact to this day among many self-styled Marxist-Leninist Maoists in the imperialist countries. This position contradicts the historical record of communist involvement in labor struggles during both the first and second-party building movements in Canada, and at least the first-party building movement in the United States, and underestimates the decisive role played by the subjective factor in shaping workers' consciousness. In the imperialist countries, there are a multitude of means by which some workers' short-term material interests become entwined with those of particular capitalists, and with the success of the capitalist system as a whole. High wages, pension plans, profit-sharing concessions, retirement and education savings, union-sponsored investment portfolios, home ownership, the list goes on and on. There is no sense in denying that individual workers stand to gain alongside capitalists in these instances, though obviously to a far lesser extent. Workers participate in these investments when their wages exceed the bare cost of reproducing their labor power. At present, they have no incentive not to do so, especially since the alternative, keeping that value invested in cash, is no less an investment, just one that is guaranteed to depreciate relative to inflation. And this alternative is not even morally superior to investing that surplus into other commodities, as money sitting in a bank will be used to flow many times its nominal value in loans by the bank and thus facilitate further exploitation in its own right. The portion of the working class that has access to this investable surplus is declining, and those who do have less of it than they used to. But there remains a large segment of the class that is involved in one or another form of capitalist investment. Does this mean that a substantial segment of workers in the imperialist countries are bought off and will defend capitalism as a way to protect their meager gains? To make such a categorical declaration is a mechanistic error. For one, it ignores the insecure and threatened nature of these gains. A Windsor auto worker who loses her job will not find another one with comparable pay, will risk losing her house and pension. A etc. Even well-off workers have a long-term interest in ending capitalism to make their material well-being more stable and secure. It also ignores the recent militancy from exactly this section of the working class in recent years. For example, the strikes of auto workers in Ontario, Sudbury miners, dockers in Montreal and BC, or aerospace workers from Rolls-Royce, Montreal. But even this is not the whole story. Crucially, this conclusion ignores the decisive role played by the subjective factor, the presence of a revolutionary party exercising leadership within the workers' movement. Without such a party offering a credible alternative for workers to struggle toward, the only options available are to fight for more within the confines of the system as it exists, or to accept less. Seriously, without a communist telling you how things could be different and how to get there, what course of actions would even be available to the overwhelming majority of workers? Notwithstanding the efforts by revolutionaries starting with the New Left in the late 1960s through to the Second Party building movement of the 1970s and early 1980s, this has been exactly the case in Canada since the expulsion of communists from the Canadian Congress of Labour, CCL, and Trades and Labour Congress of Canada, TLC, and in the United States from the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO. The crucial error of the CPUSA during the height of its influence in the labor movement among industrial workers who were winning substantial raises was its failure to develop a strategy for actually making revolution. We could add that they failed to maintain the capacity for independent labor action. This is what left them vulnerable to expulsion from the unions and subsequent repression following the conclusion of World War II. The failure was on the side of the subjective factor. Did the very same workers who were winning raises under revolutionary leadership in the 1930s really reach an objective tipping point which put them over the edge to become opportunists in the 1940s? At what wage rate or with what social reform did this quantitative accumulation precipitate a qualitative change? And what is that wage rate today? It all falls apart under the pressure of an alternative explanation. If we take seriously Lenin's theory that workers will spontaneously only develop trade union and not revolutionary consciousness, what other outcome can we expect than for economism and opportunism to prevail among the working class? To put it crudely, communists haven't been organizing workers, and so workers aren't thinking like communists. Quelle surprise. The best-off sections of the working class have objective interests that put them in opposite directions. Even those workers who make a half-decent wage that affords them a few luxuries and investments still have a long-term interest in ending capitalism. The security and fulfillment those things promise will be better guaranteed by a multinational socialist confederacy, to say nothing of the long-term survival of the human species. The same goes for the opposite sides of many contradictions among the people. Narrow, short-term interests very often exist in tension or conflict with the long-term interest in unity shared by all sections of the people. Navigating these contradictions toward their resolution in revolutionary proletarian unity is the task of communists. We cannot use the mere presence of these tensions as a pretext to abdicate our responsibility to win over these sections of the working class, or worse, declare revolution impossible. That would be like saying you can't climb a hill because the ground is on an incline. The importance of unions. It will be useful here to lay out clearly and simply the reasons for which we believe unions are an important form and site of struggle for proletarian revolution as a general overview. The caveats, qualifications, and elaborations downstream from these basic points all follow in the text below. There is a historical tendency toward proletarians combining in organizations to restrict or shut down production through collective action as a means of advancing their economic interests. They are right to do so. This basic perspective of divergent or contradictory interests between themselves and the capitalists who are immediately exploiting them and the stable organizations that give concrete expression to that collectivity are a good starting point for communists to begin work among the proletariat. Unions can be a place where workers sharpen their understanding of their collective interests and come to understand those interests they share with other workers in the same industry or even the class as a whole. They also learn the practical skills needed to fight for those interests. Unions are also typically the most democratic organization in a worker's life that can give them an opportunity to learn the skills of collective organizational life, even if in limited ways. When economic struggles escalate, They array the forces of capital against the union and provide teachable moments for communists to build the consciousness of the workers in the fight. They also position those workers to strike blows against their own capitalists, and, depending on the industry and their strength of organization, against capital as a whole. Therefore, whatever forms they exist in, whatever their particular strengths or shortcomings, unions are a site at which communists must intervene to win workers over to higher levels of political consciousness and practical organization, until such time as they are capable of moving beyond their narrow economic struggles and use their unions to wage the political struggles of the proletariat as a whole. Being the organization that exists at the point of production or circulation, a union can put this consciousness into powerful action by shutting down production, either in pursuit of workers' economic interests, or, at a higher level, in pursuit of political goals. Having laid out the abstract, ideal form of our position, we also need to contend with the ways in which reality has deformed this ideal, and grapple with what this means for our practice in light of historical lessons and concrete analysis of the present. And so it is now that we turn our attention to the main force in misdirecting modern Canadian unions, the bourgeois state. The legal regime. Whatever particular adaptations the bourgeoisie makes at the provincial level, the goals of the labor relations regime are to preserve long-term production and economic growth, and to prevent workplace struggles from spilling out to threaten social stability. This involves restrictions aimed to limit the scale and tactics of labor struggles, and to keep labor struggles focused as narrowly as possible on economic demands. Given a particular balance of forces, it is more advantageous for the ruling class to legalize and tightly regulate labor struggles than to push them all out of the bounds of legality, as this turns every economic union struggle into a potentially explosive political struggle, arraying the state in clear opposition to even the basic economic interests of workers. Pretty much every industrialized country operates within this basic framework, though with wide variation in the particulars. In Canada, unions are broadly legal and even respectable social institutions, but only insofar as they accept some of the most strict limitations on their actual power in the industrialized world. Strikes are defined extremely broadly as essentially any coordinated activity to impede production, including work to rule, slowdowns, sickouts, etc., and are inherently illegal where there is no legally recognized union present. Legal strikes are generally required to follow a lengthy process of mandatory negotiation and mediation, which must be done in good faith, as determined in Ontario, for example, by the state's Labour Board, before they are allowed, and not during the life of a collective agreement. Hard pickets that physically block entrance and exit from a job site are generally illegal, and in most jurisdictions, employers are allowed to hire scabs. Only one union may represent workers from a given unit, the unit being subject to agreement by the union and employer, or, failing that, determined by the state. There is very little wiggle room and few loopholes for labor militants within the law. When workers or unions' rights are violated, complaints go through the provincial labor boards and typically involve a years-long, expensive process. Take, for example, a company illegally threatening its employees during a certification drive, which they always do, resulting in a narrow loss for a certification vote. The union can file unfair labor practice complaints to the labor board, assuming the momentum of the campaign doesn't die while the legal process is dragged out for months or even years. The remedies offered by the labor board in all but the most extreme cases are essentially meaningless for our purposes. In those rare, extreme cases, they may order the return of employees illegally terminated for union organizing, or even grant unilateral certification to the union. But again, these are extremely rare. Most often, proven violations result in nominal fines, or mandates that the company publicly acknowledge their wrongdoing in a letter posted in the workplace. The goal of this process is, as hinted above, to kill the momentum of the campaign by diverting resources and attention away from the source of workers' power, shop floor mobilizing, and job action. Too often, companies are successful in this endeavor. All this means that, even within the framework of restrictions imposed on unions, the system is biased against us. We cannot rely on the system to save us, and it will more often be part of the enemy camp. We will need to transcend the limitations imposed on unions by the state-sponsored labor relations apparatus. This is an absolute prerequisite for even basic political strikes, as they are by definition illegal. It is also a necessary component of building class-wide struggle, given that solidarity strikes, secondary boycotts, and hot goods clauses are all outlawed. Even narrow economic strikes come with the threat of legal scab labor and back-to-work legislation, and so if we plan on being successful in those then, Realistically, we will also need to be able to systematically violate labor law. A plan and intention to do this will appeal to the most advanced of those still confined by trade union consciousness, as even they suffer under these restrictions. It may have some knowledge of the successful tactics used historically by the labor movement that are now outlawed, and yearn for a restoration of that power. Recognizing the need to do all this is not the same as having the ability to pull it off, and we would be foolish to pretend that the only thing missing is our own will to do it. Building a labor movement capable of sustained defiance of the state will be a long process of building durable organizations and patient ideological work among the masses of workers, punctuated by opportune moments of upheaval. As we grow in strength, we will want to start taking on fights and employing methods that transgress the acceptable boundaries of union tactics and union common sense. We are not there yet for the most part, but getting there practically should always be on our minds as organizers. Union line. To develop a correct line on how communists should relate to unions, we need to consider our strategic aims, the objective conditions we find ourselves in, and the subjective factors we can bring to bear on the situation. Our current strategic aim is to overthrow capitalism and establish socialism. In order to do this, we will need to be able to lead the proletariat in exercising conscious, coordinated control over production. We'll need to be able to attack the enemy by stopping production and keep it going once the working class is in charge. To do this, we will need to have leaders deeply integrated among workers in strategic industries. Such a thing is built over time, through shared struggles in such workplaces with cadres shoulder to shoulder with workers. This brings us to the question of the unions, how to relate to them, how to use them for revolutionary ends, and how to deal with their limitations. It is a maxim of labor organizing that when your union becomes threatening enough, leaders will start getting fired. Sustaining a union over time requires you to either build up new leaders to replace them, or reverse the firings by one means or another. Building new leaders takes time and draws from a limited and exhaustible pool of potential worker leaders. Ultimately, in order to build and sustain a powerful union, you need some way to reverse the firings and get your leaders their jobs back. The ideal form of this is, immediately upon leaders being fired, the rest of the workers drop their tools and shut down production until the owners concede. This implies an extremely high level of organization and militancy on the shop floor, which, under present conditions, takes years to build on the scale required to threaten production in large-scale, strategic industries. It is, for one thing, illegal, and in strategic industries would bring down state repression which the union may not be able to withstand. For another, there is a large period of time between the point an organization outgrows secret, underground tactics and the point where it is capable of halting production at will. And during this period, leaders, and by extension the whole organization, are exposed to repression by firing or worse. This opens us up to the need for alternative protections in the interim, namely, the grievance and arbitration process afforded by a collective agreement, certifying a legal union and securing a collective agreement with even minimal disciplinary concessions, requirement of cause for termination according to clearly defined rules, a standard of evidence, a progressive discipline, plus a grievance procedure, which in Canada ultimately terminates with binding arbitration by a mutually agreed third party, is an obvious and necessary tactical bridge to provide protections while we continue to build the power needed to employ more direct tactics. It is ultimately fantastical to imagine that we could build up organizations in large-scale, strategic industries capable of shutting down production, such that leaders and activists can be protected from reprisals without having legal certification as a tactical stop along the way. That's really only possible in small shops, especially in non-strategic industries where using illegal tactics is beneath the notice of the state. We need a strategy that will work in the mines and factories, not just the coffee shops. We will always need to push the limits of what is possible within the legal framework, circumvent those limitations when possible, and prepare to systematically violate it outright at opportune moments, and eventually do so systematically, such that the existing legal framework becomes unenforceable in practice. But that is very different than acting as though doing so is on the immediate agenda. As to whether certification should happen as affiliates of a larger, established union, or with a new, independent union, presumably led by the party and its allies from the outset, is a separate question. Treating the old debates about dual unionism versus boring from within as principled absolutes is an idealist error. There are many disadvantages that come with operating outside, and by implication against, the mainstream unions that are home to the overwhelming majority of organized workers. That said, those are at times outweighed by the disadvantages of working within them. Nothing is easier than to stake out an absolute position on a tactical question and insist upon it at all times and in all circumstances. But we cannot absolve ourselves of the responsibility to make a concrete analysis of the concrete situation. The objective advantages of the established unions, more resources and density in target industries, decline in their relative significance as the hypothetical independent union grows. They also bring with them whole apparatuses of part and full-time bureaucrats who have, at minimum, made peace with restrictions imposed on the working class by the labor relations apparatus, and their role in enforcing those restrictions, and have, realistically, fully accepted this, more on this later, and who will seek to oppose and undermine our attempts to build a mass-based, fighting, class against class labor movement. All this said, we are not in a strong position to start provoking the enmity of potential middle forces. There is no surer way to get bogged down defending against raids and backdoor deals between bosses and the yellow unions than to set up an independent union. We're fortunate when we win single-fronted fights. Insisting that every fight be two-fronted would doom us. Trying to build up our influence within the existing unions will mean that we will often, likely be opposed by the bureaucrats. Pursuing independent unionism at this stage means that we'll be opposed by the yellow bureaucrats every time, certainly, and with far less opportunity to patch things up and move forward with our work intact. More importantly, to the extent that those bureaucrats do actually lead their members, we will set ourselves up in opposition to those workers and their unions, undermining attempts to win them over to our political leadership. Our efforts to win leadership over those workers will be much more effective if they're spent with those unions drawing more rank-and-file members into action, campaigning for union democracy and militancy, and showing ourselves to be the most dedicated and capable fighters for the class. There may come a day when circumstances make independent unionism or something approximating it the best path forward, and we see no reason to prematurely close off that tactical avenue from this early vantage point. But for at least the foreseeable future, this is not viable, and much less advantageous, practically or politically. Nor could it possibly be. Independent trade union centers require thousands, or more realistically tens of thousands of members, including established union locals, at their founding to have any kind of practical capacity or legitimacy. And even in such a situation, we will still need forces inside the yellow unions agitating for our positions, obstructing attacks against us, and trying to build unity in action between the yellow and red centers. Starting out by forming our own independent or red union center would preclude any such possibility. So we will have to dedicate the vast majority of our forces involved in labor work to organizing with and inside the legal yellow unions, and this is not likely to change anytime soon. But doing so comes with its own set of challenges, and we have to be clear-eyed about what they are. The state, again, plays a central role in shaping those challenges. Since the very beginning of legal unionism in Canada in the 1870s, the state has attempted to use legalization to limit the scope and power of unions to exercise power and advance workers' interests. The state has likewise always used legalization as a means of inserting itself into labor disputes as a mediating force and a check on militancy. That tradition continues to this day, with a labyrinthine system of rules imposed on unions, limitations on what actions they can take and why, and the ever-present menace of back-to-work legislation, all enforced by threat of fines and jail time, seizure of assets, and unilateral decertification. Generations of labor leaders have, with notable and heroic exceptions, accepted these limitations and have thus reinforced them through practice, such that they are now the conventional common-sense norms within most unions. The unions are thus accounted for by, and to an extent integrated with, the regime of preventative counter-revolution. Capitalists, too, have learned how to use unions in many cases to limit or even undermine shop floor militancy. Predictable contract cycles, plus management prerogative, allows companies to stockpile goods ahead of strikes. Union officers are legally required to prevent and or stop any unsanctioned job action by their members, and thus act as a force for moderation and stabilization of the labor force. This moderating role extends to grievance handling too, both in essence and form, instead of shop floor disputes being a matter of what workers will tolerate, and what they are powerful enough to successfully contest. grievances become a legalistic matter of whether a given subsection of the collective agreement was technically violated. Grievances are resolved in a similarly legalistic way, with the quickie strikes of the 1930s replaced by an arduous, expensive process of mediation and arbitration, where the role of enforcement is ultimately outsourced to the state rather than the workers and their union. Politically, the union leadership in Anglo-Canada is structurally integrated with and ideologically supportive of the New Democratic Party, NDP. They have temporarily broken with that party, only rarely and only at the provincial level after outrageous betrayals, and have always come back into the fold after a few years. In Quebec, a similar relationship exists between the union leadership and both the Parti Québécois for the old guard and Québec Solidaire for the up-and-comers. Union leaders' positions are ultimately supported by state-mandated dues, check-off by the employer, and as a result there is a drift toward alienation from their membership. Many are thus more interested in maintaining good relations with the employer than with the mass involvement of the workers they represent. Indeed, such mass involvement can be a threat to their careers, not only because mass involvement produces new leaders to compete against entrenched bureaucrats for positions, but because raising workers' expectations puts those bureaucrats in the uncomfortable position of having to answer for their own failures. Union leaders are by no means a monolith, and so while there are many exceptions to this, they will often be the first line of opposition to initiatives in support of worker militancy. The closed-shop model imposed in Canada by the Rand formula reinforces this problem by forcing all workers from the most militant to the most conservative into a common democratic structure. This keeps leaders in a position of always being vulnerable to reactionary challengers, invariably supported by the bosses or rival unions, if they step too far out of line. None of these challenges negate the necessity of developing strong unions with revolutionary leadership in strategic industries if we intend to conquer power. Therefore, none of these challenges negate the necessity of communists to navigate this environment and build those unions and establish that leadership. This will be difficult, and we will have to be smart about it. The difficult but necessary thing is to advance a coherent strategy by all available tactics, and to choose specific tactics based on how well they will advance that strategy. But why limit ourselves to working with the legal unions? Why not do that where necessary, but also simultaneously work on building independent labor organizations? Can't we chew gum and walk? It's easier said than done. Will it one day make sense for the party to have some of its organizers build union structures completely outside the existing yellow union apparatus? Possibly. It's happened before. Is that the best course of action for us today, with our limited number of organizers and limited base of support among the proletariat? No. It would relegate us to the margins of the labor movement and the margins of the working class, as it has done every time it's been attempted in recent history. To chew gum and walk requires not only feet and a mouth, but a sophisticated central nervous system connected to durable muscles and bones. The revolutionary movement at present is simply not developed enough for this. A revolutionary vanguard party operating with democratic centralism is an indispensable tool here. All the laws, norms, and incentives of the labor relations apparatus direct us away from building substantial power and away from using that power for political ends. Those organizers will need the leadership of the party and the ideological and political support provided by the workers' political mass organizations, more on those below, to maintain their independence from these powerful forces pulling them toward opportunism. The party's labor organizers, particularly the leaders in this field of work, will have to be disciplined to a central plan for making revolution and understand their component part in it. Substituting this with an aggregate of individual subjective assessments by our labor organizers, a sort of ultra-democracy by omission, will doom us. We therefore propose that at our current stage of development, and in our present objective conditions, we must work within existing unions and maintain our political independence through workers' political mass organizations and the Revolutionary Vanguard Party. Practically speaking, this means organize new unions in strategic industries, organizing workers in existing unions toward a mass-based, militant, class-against-class perspective, including political action and involvement in the mass movement, building influence and political leadership within existing union locals, including winning leadership positions in those locals in order to lead the unions toward political struggle, and advancing the use of political strikes by the unions to pursue the interests of the working class as a whole. Deviations on the union line. It's important that we illustrate our union line not simply by statement of principle and intention, but in contrast to the other prevailing trends in the labor movement. We will address some of those here, as well as outline how revolutionaries should relate to them. What we've prepared here is not meant as a comprehensive taxonomy of the various trends and tendencies in the labor movement. While this would be worthwhile for someone to do at some point, it is not important enough at this stage to warrant the amount of work it would take to produce. Indeed, for some of these tendencies to really show their true nature, they would have to be confronted with the practice of a revolutionary labor line. After all, to know the taste of a pear, you have to eat it. On revolutionary syndicalism. Though revolutionary syndicalism is relatively small and weak in the present day, it exercises outsized influence among many organizers who recognize the limitations of trade unionism, including progressive and leftist activists who are sympathetic to, but not active within, the labor movement. And so it warrants significant attention here. Revolutionary syndicalism is not a single, coherent theory, but a broad category that includes a number of trends. In general, it is characterized by an emphasis on control of unions by workers rather than entrenched leaders or staff, suspicion or outright refusal of union staffers, tactical combativity as a matter of principle, organization of all workers regardless of job class or legal status, supremacy of the economic struggle as a means to liberation, up to and including rejection of political struggle by workers altogether, avoidance and/or suspicion and/or refusal of the state-sponsored labor relations apparatus and of the mainstream unions, and workers' self-management as both a strategic waypoint and ultimate goal. The most relevant historical examples of revolutionary syndicalism in Canada are the Historical Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, and the One Big Union, OBU. In the present day, the perspective is mainly presented by the contemporary IWW, though it also strongly influenced the labor initiatives of the Revolutionary Workers' Party and the Pan-Canadian PCR-RCP. There is value in the critiques this tradition levels at the labor relations apparatus and the opportunism of much of the leadership of the existing labor movement. Indeed, it is no coincidence that many of the early members of the Communist parties of both Canada and the United States were former organizers for the revolutionary syndicalist unions. Unfortunately, this perspective has not lived up to the task it laid before itself, and developing an effective revolutionary line on labor requires that we explore why. The core failure of revolutionary syndicalism is that it begins with an elevation of tactics to the level of principle. That is because it lacks a coherent strategy for getting from the present day to its goal. As a result, it is unable to make use of a diverse array of tactics, elevating them according to their ability to advance that broader strategic plan. Tactics are therefore evaluated at best according to inconsistent criteria, usually informed by a paranoia about being co-opted, or at worst as simple moral categories. Tactical concessions and compromises are therefore treated as equivalent to strategic compromises and betrayals. A few examples will illustrate what we mean. As we've laid out in this document, there is no path between today and the conquest of power that does not involve us organizing and working within the mainstream unions, at least for now. That involves a huge host of tactical compromises and exposes us to many challenges and potential pitfalls, including, we won't deny, the risk of co-optation. If, instead of trying to figure out a way to successfully navigate this environment, we avoid it entirely as the revolutionary syndicalists do, we would preclude the possibility of victory entirely. We would be unable to build power in large strategic workplaces. We'd be confined to small shops in tertiary sectors, the only places where these methods have been successful in recent history, and would, at the absolute maximum of success, be smashed practically, economically and militarily, by capital and the bourgeois state, as they would still control the critical levers of production. The same principle holds for full-time organizing staff. The sheer quantity of time, effort, thought, and attention required to build and maintain a durable union in a large workplace, especially under conditions of repression, is simply beyond the capacity of people working real full-time production jobs to sustain in the long term. This is not the same as saying that staff should be exempt from democratic controls, that they should be invested with outsized decision-making power, or even that they don't risk developing interests and perspectives that are against those of the workers. Those are real concerns, and our responsibility is to figure out how to navigate them, because the alternative, simply refusing to have full-time organizers and staff, or even just minimizing their use, effectively means abdicating our responsibility to organize unions in those large, strategic industrial sites. We see this again in debates about contractualism. Even outside large, strategic workplaces, there are obviously situations where the best course of action will be for a group of workers to accept a contract, including one with a no-strike clause, as is legally required in Canada. It may not be ideal, but it may be the best of the realistic and available options for any number of reasons. For example, the alternative may be the total defeat of the union and the scattering of its members to the four winds. It may also be a mistake. It is the difficult job of the movement and its leaders to actually evaluate the concrete situation and find the best path forward rather than abdicate the responsibility by retreating into facile statements of principle. Historical lessons of revolutionary syndicalism. The historical experience of revolutionary syndicalism in North America has been mixed. It has included heroic highs, for example, the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, which was led by revolutionary syndicalists. Revolutionary syndicalism was the leading force organizing unskilled industrial workers, as well as women, immigrant, and black workers, at a time when most mainstream unions largely refused to do so. It was revolutionary syndicalism that was the impetus behind the mainstream unions beginning to organize on an industrial rather than craft basis. Indeed, there is a living connection between revolutionary syndicalism and the communists, who successfully campaigned for amalgamation on an industrial basis within the mainstream unions, and who later formed the CIO and made industrial organizing the norm in North America. Revolutionary syndicalism first articulated many of the criticisms of the mainstream labor movement and its leaders, their class collaborationism and their national chauvinism most especially, that continue to inform revolutionaries to this day. All this credit given, there is a reason why it ultimately failed historically, and even more reasons why it continues to do so today. We can attribute the success of the IWW, and to a lesser extent the OBU, in the 1910s to three main factors. First, the refusal of the mainstream unions to organize unskilled workers, immigrants, women, and black people provided a material basis on which to build these unions and the political space for them to operate. Second, without the example of the Bolshevik Revolution as a model for taking power and a communist party promoting the same, the shortcomings of revolutionary syndicalism were not yet apparent, or at least they weren't settled questions, and so it could still attract the most militant class fighters. Third, industrial unionism as an organizational principle was better suited to fighting capitalists in the increasingly large, de-scaled industrial plants than the petty craft unionism on offer by the AFL and TLC, and so they could operate in large plants with a clear competitive advantage against the craft unions. As soon as these three factors ceased to exist, so too did the historical need for these unions, and as a result they were never able to reach anything approaching their former glory. Revolutionary syndicalism is averse to developing the all-around, i.e. economic, political, and military, power of the proletariat and all it will entail in terms of organizational forms, and the shape of society after the capitalists are defeated. The party, a regular professional people's army, the proletarian state, and suppression of the counter-revolution. Revolutionary syndicalists are therefore forced to reverse engineer a revolutionary strategy containing none of these, and the results are generally a muddle of quasi-pacifism and wishful thinking. Take, for example, the oft-quoted comment by Big Bill Haywood from his time as an IWW organizer. If the workers are organized, all they have to do is put their hands in their pockets, and they have got the capitalist class whipped. Think about that statement for a moment. Think about it in light of the century of war and massacre against workers who were unable to defend themselves militarily since these words were uttered, from Berlin to Jakarta. Do we really just have to put our hands in our pockets? Of course not. Believing this statement requires fantastical thinking whereby the entire working class plus the volunteer army of the capitalist state is organized wall to wall such that massacres won't be carried out. Police columns won't escort scabs or soldiers into essential war production facilities, and foreign imperialists won't do the same. The ruling class would never let things get to such a point without intervening with all its might well beforehand. Haywood was not alone in this error. It is a characteristic of revolutionary syndicalism. We are not the first to make this observation. In 1935, Alexander Lazovsky criticized French anarcho-syndicalist George Sorel for this very error. Rejecting the state and the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, Sorel came to reject armed uprising. In the place of uprising, he called for strike action with folded arms. Consider, too, the revolutionary strategy, really a slogan, not a strategy, so popular with the contemporary IWW, Build the general strike. This too has deeper roots in revolutionary syndicalism. Again, to quote Sorel, the theory of catastrophe is absolutely compatible with the general strike, which for the revolutionary syndicalists marks the advent of the future society. General strikes are great as tactical interventions before, during, or even precipitating a revolutionary situation. They are not, however, a substitute for successfully waging a war against the capitalist state. Civilians with, at most, minimal militia training in defensive operations are unable to overcome a disciplined army of regular soldiers or militarized police and hold territory for very long. This was true in 1919, and it's even more true today. Minimally, you need some kind of professional military formation and a political center, that is, a party, to lead it. Anything less is suicidal. The regime of preventative counter-revolution has continuously adapted itself since the heyday of the IWW and OBU, and the methods those unions used to organize large, strategically placed unions are effectively dead on arrival. It is not 1911 anymore. The state-enforced closed shop is an effective reality, and unsanctioned job action is grounds for dismissal and legal action, which none of us is in a position to withstand at present. These are the objective conditions in which we are organizing, and our strategy needs to be adapted accordingly. While we disagree with their perspectives on the strategic and political level, we do share a lot of common ground with revolutionary syndicalists, and many contemporary organizers from this tradition are more energetic, dedicated, skilled, and insightful than even many progressive trade unionists. Revolutionary syndicalists have an abiding trust in the intelligence and energy the masses of workers are capable of exerting, if properly organized, and a firm commitment to rank-and-file democracy. We will often have cause to ally with them, and where possible we should undertake comradely struggle to win them over to our line, which is more comprehensive politically and better suited to actually defeat the bourgeoisie, conquer political power, and, eventually, abolish the wage system. On trade unionism. Standing opposite to the ultra-left revolutionary syndicalist error is its conservative counterpart trade unionism. There are left, or progressive, and right, or conservative, wings with corresponding differences in strategy and organizing style, some of which will be treated separately later on. For now, we will focus on the similarities between both left and right wings of trade unionism. Across the board, trade unionism is characterized by an abiding acceptance of the capitalist system as essentially permanent. Revolution and socialism are, for the trade unionists, either impossible or downright undesirable. As Lenin illustrated in Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, this essential, general error is the starting point from which opportunists reverse engineer their whole strategic outlook, giving rise to further errors when they put it into practice. In the case of trade unionists, this is often manifested as some combination of accepting a narrow role for unions as simply bargaining over the conditions of sale for labor power, conceding control of production and management and accepting capitalism as permanent rather than fighting to overcome it, respecting the legal limits imposed on unions' tactics, bans against hard pickets, solidarity strikes, no strike clauses, etc., and further, actually believing in the legitimacy of the state. Defusing worker militancy by channeling anger away from shop floor action and toward labyrinthine, legalistic, and electoral strategies. Neglecting of organizing the unorganized into powerful unions, and focus on the narrow sectoral interests of their members rather than the class as a whole. It should be obvious on its face that this perspective is unsuited to build the class-wide unity and militancy required to carry out political strikes, much less revolutionary ones. This should come as no surprise, as this is not the goal of trade unionism. However, and this is of great interest to revolutionaries, trade unionism in North America has been a failure on its own terms as well. Trade unionism, especially its more conservative and bureaucratic strains, has been losing a defensive war for over half a century. It is uncontested in its dominance of the labor movement in North America, and so we can fairly judge it by its results. By any objective measure, trade unionism is leading the labor movement into obscurity and defeat. The erroneous trade unionist perspectives outlined above can actually worsen the contradiction between union leaders and their members. In this framework, it is the union leaders first and foremost telling the workers that they must accept defeat in whatever form it takes, stagnating wages, work speed-ups, provocation from management, rather than direct workers' anger toward efforts that might overcome the limits placed on their power by the system of labor control. Conservative trade unionists develop contempt for the workers or maybe try to recruit them to some hopeless electoral campaign. For all this, trade unionists are usually the face of the union to the workers, and even basic servicing, handling grievances, bargaining, etc., allows them to build goodwill, influence, and leadership among the workers over time. For all their failures and shortcomings, the union is often the most democratic institution in a person's life. It is also the only organization legally bound to fairly represent them, to represent their interests as workers, however inadequately they may do so. For many workers, including many of the formal and informal leaders we will have to win over, this has tremendous importance. They see loyalty to their leaders and defense of their union as one and the same thing. In many circumstances then, gaining influence in unions led by conservative trade unionists requires patience, tact, diplomacy, and a willingness to prove oneself to the workers as a competent and dedicated fighter for their interests. Simply running an opposition campaign to denounce the bureaucrats will end in failure or at best entrench a powerful conservative opposition bloc within your local. Generally, the advanced forces in a unionized shop will gravitate toward involvement in the union. Doing so implies at least a nominal belief in collective rather than individual solutions to workplace issues, commitment to the interests of workers as workers in opposition to management, and a willingness to put work in to improve other people's lives. Notwithstanding this, it is possible to find potentially advanced elements in a shop among those who have nothing to do with or even actively dislike their unions when we first meet them, as well as among those who are already trade union activists. The benefit and drawbacks of trade unionism cause both to occur naturally as part of the incoherent and idiosyncratic politics developed by a class without revolutionary leadership. To their credit, the progressive trade unionists will try to channel workers' anger into struggles within the bounds of the existing system, sometimes even attempting to organize mass participation in those efforts, though almost always directed toward economic bargaining with their employer and nothing beyond that. This difference is relevant to us as revolutionaries, and there is sometimes enough common ground with these progressives, at least at the tactical level, that we can try to build alliances with them. We should bring these progressives along with us as far as they are willing to go, but we also need to be careful not to liquidate our capacity for independent action. Historically, labor progressives have variously allied with and opposed revolutionaries, most spectacular in founding the Congress of Industrial Organizations alongside the American and later Canadian communists, only to expel them from the same union a few years later. There are union activists, leaders, and staffers who want to overcome the erroneous trade unionist line, but are for one reason or another unable to break out of the limitations imposed by this way of thinking, and its enforcement in their unions and the whole labor relations apparatus. They will agree with every single one of our criticisms of the existing labor movement and may even call themselves socialists or revolutionaries. But they will, if left on their own, spend entire careers committing the very errors we criticize. For some genuinely well-intentioned people working within the unions, the main barriers are the fact that up until now there has been no revolutionary line on labor, and no movement guided by this line to meaningfully call the question. The failure so far is ultimately ours, as revolutionaries, to produce this. Again, without a party bringing forward revolutionary politics until very recently, we can only expect trade union consciousness to have prevailed. Our organizers need to master the art and science of united front work with progressive forces inside the labor movement, and with all possible forces in the labor movement against capital. We need to operate somewhere between united front without compromise and united front at any cost. Again, two easy but useless absolutes. Organization and intervention. Having laid out our general understanding of the labor movement and its situation in an overall revolutionary strategy, it is necessary to lay out the specific forms our interventions should take. Given the general state of disorganization among communists, labor militants, and, subsequently, the working class more broadly, most of this work will involve building new organizations or strengthening existing ones. They are laid out here from those with the broadest basis of support to the most specific. Organize unions. When we talk about working within the unions, we obviously do not mean that our only way of doing so is to go get jobs at places that already have unions. We also need to organize the unorganized in massive numbers. Of the strategic industries identified above, only 3, healthcare, education, and utilities, have even a bare majority of workers unionized. For most others, it's between 20% and 40%, and for agriculture, it's less than 4%. One way or another, this will have to change if we're serious about defeating capital. Of course, when we say organize unions, we mean more than simply winning a certification drive. We want to organize democratic fighting unions that are a means for workers to build power on the job and ultimately in society as a whole. This means using strategy to rely on mass participation of workers, a basic class against class outlook, and militant determination in the face of the enemy. Doing this well will mean a combination of proper organizing methods during a drive, proper selection of union affiliation, and maintenance of democratic committee structures after certification. It is a lot of work, and we will have to be smart about it. Communist union organizing is similar in its mechanics to what most progressive trade unionists and revolutionary syndicalists practice. In fact, both of these will often explicitly trace the lineage of their organizing methods to the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, as a means of legitimatization. It is essentially a process of identifying organic social leaders and recruiting them into a committee that can lead the whole workplace. Within that broad overview are a number of skills and strategies which are not often spontaneously present among the people willing to be union organizers, but they absolutely are teachable. While there are roles to play for people who are not good organizers, a solid core of skilled and experienced union organizers must be the backbone of our labor efforts. This in turn means that most organizers will also need to be teachers and mentors of each new crop of new organizers. Organizers need to be force multipliers. Organizing a large industrial shop takes time, effort, and resources. Militants who go get hired at a target shop in order to organize are an indispensable force in these fights. The daily face-to-face contact and shared burdens between these militants and their co-workers allows them to form strong bonds with the workers, accurately identify their leaders, assist in recruitment to the union drive, and give credibility to the most advanced ideas being brought forward in the course of the struggle. There may be no better training for communist militants in the discipline and basic organizing skills required for us than to salt for a couple years before implanting in the newly organized shop, nor a better way for communists to dig in and build up a base of support among the proletariat. Such militants alone, however, are not adequate for a successful union drive at a large shop. There are hard limits on how large a structure a person can lead for an extended length of time while also working a full-time production job. A very good leader can do this with perhaps 50 people, 7 sub-leaders, each leading their own group of roughly 7 workers. Beyond that, there simply aren't enough hours in a week to keep up the necessary background work, one-on-one meetings, processing information and planning, following up on tasks, to sustain and grow such a structure. Things get neglected and people fall off. All this is before taking into account the scheduling challenges posed by having 40+ hours a week spoken for on the part of both the organizer and the workers they're leading. At a certain point, the need for full-time external organizers is unavoidable. You need people who are essentially available around the clock, with cars, to distribute propaganda, recruit workers and lead them through the day-to-day minutiae of the drive. Think through the strategic problems of the campaign, interface with the union apparatus that will do the necessary filings, etc. It's a lot of work and it has to be done. It also puts those organizers in a position to exercise outsized influence over the campaign and run it according to their own interests, rather than those of the workers themselves, or to lead it down an erroneous trade unionist path. Communists, then, need to be equipped to struggle with staff organizers and win the workers over to our positions over a variety of issues, including reliance on action by workers to combat management repression, rather than retreating into the endless and demobilizing process of legal complaints. Tactical escalation rather than capitulation. Democracy within the structures of the organizing drive, within the limits imposed by a prolonged secret phase. And commitment to see the fight through to victory rather than cutting and running when the challenges of the campaign make the union's cost-benefit analysis turn against it. Once a union local is certified and it has its own democratic leadership structure, we will similarly have to be prepared to struggle over these questions, and others outlined in this document, with various staffers and representatives from the larger union apparatus. None of this will be easy or fun, but it is no less necessary, and we need to be prepared to struggle intelligently. While we reject the theory that the labor aristocracy comprises a large portion of the working class in Canada who are so materially invested in imperialism and its spoils that they are bound to be an obstacle to revolution, this does not preclude us from recognizing that the working class is stratified, and that there is a material basis for conservatism among the upper strata, especially absent revolutionaries, to organize them around an alternative. This has long been the case among skilled, credentialed, and higher paid sections of the class. These also happen to be the most densely unionized sections of the proletariat, and the opportunism that guides almost all unions today consolidates that opportunism among them. This gives added urgency to the task of organizing the unorganized. Influxes of raw, poorly paid workers forged in the fire certification fights and looking to win improvements to their dire conditions of work will be essential to changing the balance of forces within the unions. Led by communists, these workers can be a force for the transformation of those unions. Winning certification fights can likewise give communist leaders an opportunity to prove themselves within the labor movement, with this demonstration of seriousness and competence serving as a basis on which to build influence. Of course, we do not simply organize unions for their own sake. We organize them in order to exercise power. Striking. An important means by which the proletariat exercises power is through its control of production. Exercising power through control of production means one of two things: producing when production is organized in the interests of the proletariat, and shutting down production when it is organized in the interests of capital. The former may occur to a limited extent prior to the proletariat's seizure of state power. For example, diverting resources from capitalist enterprises to revolutionary forces, after which point it will be the norm. Until then, the proletariat exercises its economic power to pursue first economic, then political, and eventually revolutionary objectives by shutting down production, by striking. Strikes serve several important functions beyond just their use as a weapon by the workers to win concessions. Strikes clearly array the forces of the workers against the whole economic and political apparatus of the bourgeoisie, that is, management as well as the bourgeois media, the police, and the politicians, and so demonstrate to the workers a clear division between themselves and their enemies. Strikes demonstrate to workers a degree of the power they can collectively exercise, thus instilling in them a sense of collectivity and a confidence to press forward in pursuit of more ambitious goals. Sustaining a strike requires the creation and coordination of auxiliary and reproductive, logistical, and even limited coercive apparatuses, which serve as limited functional organs of workers' power. Effective strike tactics also draw in forces from outside the struck shop. In fact, this is a vital component of not just political strikes, but even simple economic strikes, where production halting mass pickets must be sustained for weeks or months in the face of state repression. This necessitates broader political work, for example, by a workers' political mass organization, both to lay the groundwork for this mobilization and to actually carry it out when the time comes. This too will array friends and enemies for all to see and provide material verification of our agitation for a class against class perspective among the workers. These all contribute to favorable objective conditions for the development of a revolutionary class consciousness. Converting that potential for the development of revolutionary consciousness into a reality depends on the effective intervention of the subjective factor, on revolutionaries, and their ability to earn ideological and political leadership among those workers. While it would be incorrect to say that it is always a good idea to strike, striking does have inherent value for us as communists. One of our jobs as communists, therefore, is to create the conditions for striking to be advantageous. Every contract negotiation is an opportunity to push the contradictions between the workers and capital to their sharpest. Further to this, strike readiness is a capacity that needs to be maintained through use. The best way to ensure you won't be strike ready is to not strike. The ultimate long-term aim of our labor line is for the proletariat to use its economic power to carry out revolutionary strikes. That is, strikes aim specifically at provoking revolutionary situations and materially weakening the bourgeoisie to facilitate their defeat by the revolutionary forces. We are a long way from this. A meaningful step along the way is for the proletariat to use that economic power to pursue its political goals, or in other words, political strikes. These are illegal in Canada, so even getting to the point where workers can pull them off will be a massive, long-term undertaking and will require that we have strategic coordination across regions and industries, as well as a robust propaganda apparatus. Political strikes will pull unorganized workers into political life as they see the strike fight for their interests, investing them in the strike's success. Workers will also be forced to clarify their political priorities. This creates a dialectic within the party whereby important information on the class's interests can be gleaned and opportunities for the party to exercise political leadership emerge. And in the best scenarios, political strikes can win concessions which materially change the balance of forces in favor of the proletariat. In all things, our tactical decisions are subordinated to and in service of our strategic aims. to build up the power of the working class, especially industrial workers, to implant the party in that sector and develop its leadership within it, and to bring industrial proletarians into the party for the purpose of using their economic power as a weapon in a more general war, for the overthrow of the capitalist system and its replacement by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Whatever the shortcomings of the first party building movement, it is indisputable that their interventions in the labor movement far surpassed anything we have seen since, and much of the guidance given to revolutionaries working in the labor movement in those days remains valid, or at least serves as a useful point of departure for revolutionaries today, especially at the level of tactics. William Z. Foster's American Trade Unionism, a compilation of his writings spanning a little over 2 decades, serves as a time capsule of sorts for exactly this guidance. All the tactical advice we cite from that body of work is underpinned by a few firm principles. The power of workers comes from their vast numbers and their ability to shut down production. Exercising that power must be a truly democratic and participatory process for the workers involved. Workers must rely on their own power, not those of the state, the bosses, etc., to advance their interests. And, when workers are properly organized, they have tremendous bravery, endurance, and creativity. When these principles are put into the everyday practice of labor work, they should have the following characteristics or should be guided by the following principles. All decisions regarding strikes must be in the hands of the workers themselves rather than through official intermediaries. This includes starting and ending strikes, and also the bargaining process before and during a strike. Avoid arbitration as much as possible, and if it can't be avoided, then strive to settle as much as possible in the workers' favor before arbitrating the rest, as this process is stacked against the workers and by its nature takes the workers and the power they can exercise out of the fight. Enforcement of contract terms is an ongoing fight. Employers sign contracts when they must and violate them when they can. Industrial unions should try to secure national agreements that cover the whole industry. This is important because it prevents employers from moving operations to cheaper regions of the country. It brings a wider swath of the class into the struggle along clear lines of workers versus capitalists, and by virtue of involving the whole industry, it calls out for political answers. Different unions with the same employer or in the same industry should try to line up their contracts to expire at the same time. Contracts should be short, around 2 years at most. Strikes should be a majority decision made through democratic channels, not unauthorized minority actions. Workers' political mass organizations and caucuses. Political strikes cannot happen in a vacuum. For an inherently illegal strike over a political demand to have a chance of success, the demands need a strong base of support among the working class as a whole. The class needs the organizational means to mobilize in support of that strike, and indeed they need to see the strike as an extension of their own fight for the demand. There is no question of evading repression legalistically, and even less of doing so militarily, for a long time to come. Our only shield is the support of the people. Our union work is decidedly focused on workers in the strategic industries required for the daily reproduction of capitalist society. But our political program is in the interests of the working class as a whole. Building workers' political mass organizations allow us to link these two streams by which we organize workers as workers. Conditions for the proletariat are deteriorating rapidly, and so there is no shortage of demands around which these WPMOs could be organized. Rent control laws, improved social services, labor law reforms, the list goes on. As the movement grows and WPMOs proliferate, so too will the demands they organize around. In the shops, we will agitate against the inadequacy of striking over purely economic demands. Outside the shops, we will agitate against the inadequacy of having political demands that we aren't striking for. The caucus, on the other hand, is a body meant to organize advanced workers in a shop to influence their union, run slates of candidates for leadership, and where appropriate, take action outside the official labor relations and union apparatuses. For example, organizing a wildcat strike. The generally appropriate level of political unity should roughly approximate the medium-term goals of our labor work: rank-and-file democracy, a class-against-class perspective, and emphasizing the need for the working class to use strikes as a means of exercising political power. A caucus should be made up of rank-and-file workers as well as stewards, committee members, and officers who uphold and advance the perspectives of the caucus. A caucus should have its own internal democratic leadership structure and division of labor with dues-paying membership, and should ideally be organized along industrial rather than union-specific lines. Caucuses are potentially useful whether party members formally lead the union apparatus or not. The purpose of a caucus as we conceive it is to influence the official apparatus of the union by various means, to build a base of support for rank-and-file democracy and class-against-class militancy, and to carry out action independent of the union apparatus. They serve to help militant union leaders carry out that militant agenda agenda and act as a democratic check on leadership who may be tempted toward capitulation. They are also a tool for carrying out the class struggle regardless of changes to the labor relations apparatus. For example, if the Rand formula was scrapped and open shops became the new law of the land, caucuses would form the initial organizational backbone of our new post-Rand unions. Even in a situation where party members and mass activists under their leadership have a total monopoly on official positions in the union, the mandatory closed shop and dues checkoff means we're bound together organizationally and democratically accountable to even the most conservative elements of the workers. This both incentivizes a drift toward the center for labor radicals, who must try to avoid a reactionary revolt among their constituents, and necessitates an effective counterweight to the conservative forces. The caucus can fulfill both functions, provided it has an active membership beyond the elected leaders themselves. A caucus cannot simply be a slate of candidates for leadership. It can run or endorse a slate, but in order to be fully effective, it needs to recruit an active membership beyond that, producing agitation and educational material, building alliances with progressive and revolutionary forces outside the shop, and winning organic leaders over to the caucus's agenda are all mainstays of its work. It also needs to produce propaganda and make interventions within the union under its own auspices. While caucuses will most often have their origins within specific shops, we should be trying to build them into bodies covering entire industries, both by unifying individual workplace caucuses operating in the same industry and by initiating them outright using workers organized outside the shops in the WPMOs. This will eventually allow us to coordinate industry-wide action across different unions and make impactful interventions in the larger workers' movement. The caucus is the living organizational link between the workers' political mass organizations and the workers in the shop. It will be the body that endorses the demands of the WPMOs, imports them into the union, and agitates for them more generally. In situations advanced enough to support it, they will even affiliate openly to the WPMOs and constitute its labor wing. Workplace cells. The workplace cell is an organizational unit of the party consisting of the members who work at a particular shop, further subdivided as necessary down to the department or even work unit level. The cell is not an independent body, but is a subordinate part of a larger branch, nor is it necessarily the party unit involved in a given shop struggle, as propaganda and auxiliary responsibilities could be delegated by the branch to other cells. It is, however, the body the party members directly involved in a shop struggle ought to belong to, including, depending on the circumstances, external organizers. The presence of the party fraction is vital to developing our work. There is simply no substitute for having comrades you see eye to eye with working on the same immediate project as you are. Being able to fully let your guard down politically, talk openly about recruitment prospects, and explore the absolute most advanced perspective on the issues at hand is extremely helpful in synthesizing the correct line to take back to the workers in the shop. You need the space to talk openly about tactics, slogans, and long-term plans that may be on or beyond the edge of what you're capable of actually leading people into at a given moment. If you don't have that, it's too easy to fall into either conservative or adventurous subjectivism. At the same time, simply bringing up these topics with people who aren't ready to talk about them can damage your leadership and credibility in the shop. This is the unique benefit of having a workplace cell in the shop. The presence of a workplace cell also makes the party immediate and pertinent to those advanced workers who are party ready. It minimizes the perceived tension between contributing time, energy, and attention to party work versus union work, when the two are more functionally united in this way. As a result, workplace cells help the party grow among the industrial proletariat and also strengthen the proletarian contingent within the party. The workplace cell also serves to reduce the gap between decisions made by individual labor leader or party members and the central plan of revolution. It functions both to break the spell of individual subjectivity in determining the correct course of action in a given shop, which is often a matter of judgment calls regarding granular details only comprehensible to those on the front line, and the immediate enforcer of discipline to the central plan on organizers and leaders. Workplace cells will be the cogwheels by which the party can exert influence over, and eventually lead, the union apparatus. Building these workplace cells is therefore fundamental to worker centrality on both the tactical and strategic level. Care must be taken, though, that the workplace cell not become the place where the work of the union itself is planned. This creates confusion among the rank and file as they sense decisions are being made behind the scenes of their formal democratic structures. What's planned by the cell is the party's interventions in the shop and the union. In situations where the goal of establishing workplace cells is not yet feasible, a cell can be established by comrades organizing in a given industry, sector, or industrial district as the situation allows. They should be working toward establishing workplace cells, and in the meantime, leading the work of the party's labor organizers under its jurisdiction. Forging a revolutionary working class. The NCPC's labor line places workers' centrality at the center of our strategy to forge a revolutionary class. Our line reaffirms what communists knew and practiced in the first and second party building movements in Canada, that workers can exert tremendous power because of their place in production and circulation, and this economic power must be harnessed by the party toward revolutionary political aims. By staging battles on shop floors and developing the organizational capacity of the class in workplace cells, caucuses, unions, and workers' political mass organizations, communists lead workers into direct class conflict. We build and politicize the economic struggles of workers until we're capable of waging political strikes, treating every picket line of every strike as a novel training ground for class fighters and new revolutionaries. We need to develop both the subjective forces and the objective organs of proletarian class power in order to prepare the longer-term possibility for revolutionary strikes that could, at some future date, meaningfully shift the balance of forces. To get where we want to go from where we're at, we must orient communists back into the labor movement and regain ground that has been eroded for more than 40 years. As we operationalize this line through practice, we will contend with the opportunism of labor aristocrats, those bureaucrats employed by or adjacent to unions who have lost allegiance to their class and stifle the combativeness that erupts from workers as conditions continue to worsen across all sectors and industries. We must also become astute at struggling against opportunism, both right and left varieties, within the class itself, and increasingly move advanced workers to see the necessity of revolution and communism. This is a political and ideological struggle necessary to forging a fighting class. There will be no shortcuts. Let's get started.